Hugh Hewitt in Studio West, joined by the Smart Guys 2.0. Steve Vladeck teaches at the University of Texas Law School, Con Law. He is a man of the left. Jonathan Adler teaches from Case Western Reserve University Law School in Cleveland. He's a man of the right. They join me. They are the Smart Guys 2.0. Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for getting up early. Steve, always customary for me to go to the guy who's outnumbered. And I just want your straight up assessment of the Garage Gate, as its hashtag is, the Biden documents. What do you think is going on?
Well, I mean, Hugh, I think two different things are true. I think the Biden team has been careless when it comes to making sure that it has returned all of the documents that were in the former vice president, the former senator's possession. I think that that carelessness is a symptom of a broader disease where the National Archives has been, I think, insufficiently tight-fisted in its control of documents held by senior officials after they're done being senior officials. And I think efforts to compare it to what former President Trump did are laughable on their face, given that former President Trump first spent 18 months denying that he had any such documents in his possession. Then, when asked for those documents and given a subpoena for those documents, misrepresented what was in his possession, and then tried to argue that they actually were his documents and not the government. So I think we can say two things. Biden really was, I think, careless, regardless of what he knew, and his carelessness pales in comparison to what we saw from former President Trump in a very similar, at least outwardly, context.
Professor Jonathan Adler, your take on GarageGate.
Well, at first, I should say we're still learning things. Every time we think we know the extent of what's going on here, suddenly there are more documents. Suddenly there are documents in an additional place. Suddenly there are documents not just from the president's time as vice president, from his time at the Senate. But I agree with Steve that this shows that we don't keep good track of classified documents. I would argue we classify too much. I think it also confirms that senior political officials, unlike people in the military, unlike career folks within the national security establishment, are very careless and tend not to be held to account for their carelessness with classified material. And given statements that the president has made within the past month about how could anyone be this careless and so on when he himself is doing it, I think it highlights that we need to have a lot more accountability here about how this material is handled, how it is kept, and what happens when people don't handle it properly. Because it's not reasonable that a member of the military or a career official in the State Department or NSA or whatever can have their career ruined. But we can make jokes about whether or not the president had a box of documents next to his Corvette.
I got read into top secret Senate Department information in 1984. I've held the highest clearances when I was the counterintelligence special assistant to attorneys general. Quick question, but I'm not a prosecutor. Never prosecuted a case. Have either of you ever held a clearance, and have either of you ever prosecuted a case? I'm just curious. Steve?
I have not held a clearance. I haven't prosecuted a case.
You have not, or you have?
I have not.
Okay. Jonathan, have you?
I've had a clearance. I was an advisor for a trade advisory committee, so I had to have a clearance for that had to get renewed every certain number of years, but I have not prosecuted a case.
Okay. So I am wondering, I asked that because this looks weird to me. 4 different trips to the Biden properties. And I keep Trump and Hillary out of this. I'm just focused on this. And I've got a very experienced former AUSA and senior political lawyer at Justice and at the White House telling me this looks like a response to a grand jury subpoena. Do you two think that? No one's asked that. Has the president been subpoenaed? Has Dr. Biden been subpoenaed? Have the owner of the properties in Rehoboth and Wilmington been subpoenaed, whether it's a trust, whatever? Because it sure looks like a response to a subpoena to me. What do you think, Steve?
I don't see any evidence of that. I mean, obviously, I don't see any evidence to conclusively disprove that. But when it comes to a subpoena, I mean, the president's team has said that his compliance has been voluntary, that they were the ones who reached out to DOJ. That's, Hugh, a pretty bold statement to make if they reached out to DOJ only after being served with a grand jury subpoena. I'm sure there are people who don't believe what the White House is saying in this space. I will just say that until there's some evidence that they are lying, not just misrepresenting, here it would be affirmatively lying, I don't think this is a response to a grand jury subpoena. I think, as Jonathan said, this is just a sign that we have for far too long allowed senior officials, whether they be the vice president, whether they be senior members of the U.S. Senate, to really have sort of a lackadaisical approach when it comes to holding on to and not returning classified information. And that's a broader problem that we ought to talk about reforming without just saying, Biden is somehow a unique culprit in this space.
I don't think he's unique at all. I think pretty much every senior official walks away with stuff they shouldn't take. But Jonathan, what about the question? Because it has not been asked and answered. And the way to frame it for Karine Jean-Pierre is, has the president or anyone connected to him, Dr. Biden or any entity controlling this property, has been received a subpoena that touches on there? Do you think that's a fair question to ask? And do you think there is a subpoena here?
I think it's a fair question to ask. I agree with Steve that I think that that's pure speculation at this point. I would assume at this point, not only are the Bidens folks scouring every property where something could be. I'm assuming the Obama folks are doing that. I'm assuming the Bush folks are doing that. I'm assuming the Pence folks are doing that. Unfortunately, this is the sort of thing that should occur as a matter of course when folks leave office. This is a sort of thing. But we know that as a general matter, we know that President Biden, in a wide range of contexts, has not been the most diligent about activities and relationships and taking care of things in ways that could create an appearance. As we all know, with all the things related to his son, whether you think there's malfeasance there or not, it's clear that there's been a cavalier attitude about doing things by the book the way they should be done, so such questions cannot even be asked. It should bother us, Hugh, that you can even ask that question and we can't just laugh it off. I'm trying to put together what explains this fact pattern. I understand, we've got a document, let's go back, look everywhere. I understand screwing up the first search. I understand maybe even screwing up the second search. I don't understand screwing up the third search and then bringing in the FBI for the fourth search. Steve, isn't that odd?
Yes and no, Hugh. I think the problem is we also don't know what the internal conversations were like. So for example, right, there was a report over the weekend that there was a miscommunication between the Penn Biden Center and the sort of the household, the folks who actually have access to the garage, about what they were looking for and when they were looking for it. So, again, I think, I am one of those who thinks it was appropriate for the Attorney General to appoint a special counsel. I think this is the kind of thing where an investigation is by no means indefensible, but I still think it's, we're jumping to a lot of conclusions to think that this is more than just a combination of the carelessness that I think all three of us agree pervades this class of folks in Washington, and what could very easily have just been miscommunication problems. It's possible the special counsel will find more. I will just go on record as saying I think that's unlikely, that this is going to be more than just carelessness compared to the Mar-a-Lago version of the story, which is a very different and much less negligence-driven story. But I think we ought to be careful. The same folks who think that folks were quick to rush to judge former President Trump, it's kind of ironic now if they are now quickly rushing to judge President Biden.
No, I agree with almost everything you said. I'm not rushing to judge President Biden because one page of one document can get people killed. 5,000 pages of idiocy that's classified doesn't get anyone killed. So it depends on what the documents are, what the classification was, and why they were there. I'm just looking at the facts and circumstances around this. So Jonathan Adler, if in fact the Hunter Biden grand jury is standing up, how do we learn about it? The last thing I read about it was a Devlin story in the Washington Post in October, and it's been dark since then. I just don't know anything about how grand juries get leaks out. John Eastman's grand jury, part of the Smart Guys 1.0, is leaking like a sieve all the time. Why do some grand juries leak and other ones don't?
Well, I think sometimes that's a question of who's on the grand jury. I think more likely it's a question of whether or not the prosecutors want to leak information, because I think typically that's where it's going to come. Or, of course, someone who testifies might be the source. But I think it's a question of who the individuals are. We don't know. I presumably will know when decisions are made. And in the meantime, that leaves lots of room for lots of speculation.
Now, Steve, I want to turn to the special counsel because you brought it up. I've explained again and again, special counsels are different from independent counsels. There's no more independent counsel statute. We're back to special counsels. The best and only good thing about the independent counsel law, I clerked to the 3-judge panel that appointed them in the 80s. They reimbursed every person who ran up a legal bill if they weren't indicted under that law. You don't get reimbursed under the special counsel regulations. How unfair is that?
I mean, there are a lot of things about the special counsel regulations that I think are problematic. But of course, the critical word there is regulations. The Justice Department cannot appropriate funds by itself. And so, I am actually perhaps the last defender of the independent counsel statute. I think there are...
No, I'm number 2. Reforming it would work.
Yes. But I think this is the position that Congress, by allowing the statute to expire in 1999, put the Department of Justice in. And I think, if you go, as recently as 2017, if you look at the hearings that the Senate Judiciary Committee held about the special counsel regulations, I think there are lots of constructive suggestions out there about how to bolster the special counsel regulations, about how to make the process more fair. And I will just say, this is not directed at either of you, but in 2017, it was Senate Republicans who were opposed to those reforms, perhaps by dint of who was then in office.
I don't know what they were. I only know one person who got sidewinded by the Clinton special counsel, and they ran up a 7-figure legal bill, which got reimbursed because Ken Starr was appointed by the Independent Counsel Committee. Completely innocent, completely nothing to do here. But, you can't, Jonathan, let's close up. You can't screw around when a prosecutor knocks on your door, right? You got to lawyer up.
You do, and with either the independent counsel or the special counsel, you have to remember this is a prosecutor that has one target. So they're not going to set your case aside because something else big comes along. They're given this and only this, and that creates a sort of tunnel vision. It creates a sort of, monomaniacal focus on a particular issue without regard for whether or not it's the most important thing. And as I clerked for a judge that oversaw the 3-judge panel as well. And
which one?
Bills were crazy. I'm sorry?
Which I had Roger Robb, and we appointed Jacob Stein to investigate Ed Meese, and he set the land speed record of 6 months for an IC investigation. Who'd you clerk for?
I clerked for Judge Santel, and when I was clerking for him in 2000, we were still seeing requests for reimbursement from years before for people you hadn't even heard of, but who were connected to one of the many Clinton era independent counsels.
It's just fair, though. Steve Vladeck and Jonathan Adler, I hope you guys both write about the special counsel / independent counsel law, because this is not the way it should work. 3 of them with no clock. Thank you both, professors. I'll be right back, America, on the Hugh Hewitt Show.